Good morning. My name is Maya Berry. I'm the Executive Director of the Arab American Institute. Thank you so much for joining us this morning in what I know is not an ideal building location. But I'm pleased to have some of you with us. We have, it's going to be a small crowd, but there are others who regretfully couldn't be with us, including Congressman Chu, because they are voting now on the new Speaker of the House. So there's some staff who would normally be with us that were regretfully pulled away. But we're still going to have a wonderful, robust conversation. We're convening our briefing today entitled "The Department of Justice Guidance on Profiling the Work That Remains," because this is one of those topics of conversation that we in the advocacy community on issues of striking a better balance between civil rights and civil liberties in the post 9/11 environment continue to raise. But it's one that hasn't been getting a lot of traction after December of 2014. The initial guidance, entitled "The Guidance Regarding the Use of Race by Federal Law Enforcement Agencies," were issued in June of 2003 by then Attorney General John Ashcroft. And the idea was that law enforcement ought not to profile when engaging in their duties, and therefore they issued this guidance. And in fairness, that it seems to make sense, right? Everyone would want to come out and say that makes a lot of sense. Regretfully, that was not the case, as the guidance contained a tremendous amount of loopholes that allowed law enforcement to continue to profile. So as a result, one of the things that the Obama administration committed to as the Obama campaign, and then subsequent after their election, was that they would look at the profiling guidance and try to do better so that we can have a more equitable justice system on these issues. The much anticipated guidance came out in December of 2014. Attorney General Eric Holder even saw this as something as part of his legacy, that his time he would leave us with a revised and more equitable guidance in place. So those entitled "The Guidance for Federal Law Enforcement Agencies Regarding the Use of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, National Origin, Religion, Sexual Orientation, or Gender Identity." Now, the title would suggest that additional groups were added and protected as a result of that, and while that is certainly the case, the most egregious problem was still there, which is that there are two primary loopholes that exist with regards to border security and border security. Thank you. And national security. And the fact that they don't apply to local law enforcement. So there are a variety of reasons for why even the guidance announced in December of 2014 were not adequate. So that day, when the Attorney General released that guidance, we put out a statement after being on a call with him that morning, and I just want to just read you very briefly from that statement, because I think it frames the reason why we convene these conversations and why we continue to work on these issues. We had the opportunity to join other civil rights groups on a call with U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder in advance of the Justice Department's release of the much anticipated new guidance regarding the use of profiling. In the frank discussion with Attorney General Holder, we asked specifically what we tell our community about the differences these new guidelines will have on some of the most pressing issues facing Arab Americans and American Muslims today. Regretfully, the answer to that question appears to be very little. While the goal of eliminating profiling is the admirable stated objective, and the new guidance importantly expands the definition of profiling to include new protected characteristics, including national origin and religion, the updated DOJ guidance falls short of protecting the rights of all Americans. And I would say to you that in October of 2015, we're nowhere further than we were on that day in December of 2014. So with that, I'm delighted and honored that we have with us the group that we do today, because these are the folks on the front lines of this issue. I'm going to very quickly give you their bio, and then go ahead and get started with our conversation. Sakira Cook is the counsel in the Public Department of the Leadership Conference on Civil Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. At the Leadership Conference and the Education Fund, Sakira facilitates the development of federal policy agenda on reform of the criminal justice system and a broad coalition of civil and human rights groups, and monitors and analyzes current federal civil rights issues and legislation. Thank you, Sakira, for being with us. To my left is Jennifer Bellamy, who is the Legislative Counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union Washington, D.C. office. Prior to joining the ACLU, Jennifer was the policy advisor for World Vision, an international humanitarian organization serving in 100 countries. And last but not least is Arjun Singh. He's the Director of Law and Policy of the Sikh Coalition as of June of 2015. In his role, he is responsible for advocating and promoting policy solutions to civil rights issues that impact Sikhs and the broader American public. Before that, Arjun was actually with the ACLU as well, here in Washington. So with that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just provide brief remarks in the beginning, each sort of focusing on a different area of this, and then we'll open it up for a discussion of questions and answers. So Sakira, why don't we start with you on the sort of broader frame on the guidance piece.
Thank you, and thanks Maya and the Arab American Institute for having me here today to talk about an issue that the Leadership Conference has been working on for over 12, 13, or 14 years, actually. And one that's we find to be extremely important and relevant in the current moment that we find ourselves in this country, where we are seeing African American and Latino and other communities of color being somewhat targeted by law enforcement in many contexts. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement is sort of shining a light to some extent on the interactions that African Americans communities have with law enforcement, and also situations that we're seeing with Muslim and Arab communities with hate violence and anti-Muslim rhetoric and Islamophobia and xenophobia extending across, you know, our society. So in that context, the fact that we still have loopholes to strong enforcement and a strong ban on the use of race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, gender, and gender identity in the context of law enforcement activities, whether it's a stop, a pedestrian stop or a traffic stop, or whether it's while traveling in the airport or on the train, is a huge issue. And much of the unrest that we're seeing and much of the interactions between law enforcement that we're seeing start initially with, in our opinion, an act of profiling. And so for this guidance not to both extend to state and local law enforcement and also not cover loopholes for national security and border integrity is extremely unnerving. And until we're able to effectively address that and work with our administration to effectively address that, we will probably continue to see things that we're seeing and the mistrust that we're seeing between law enforcement and the communities that are most underrepresented. And so I can talk a little bit more about, you know, what loopholes exist and some of the activities that we're doing to try to, you know, close those loopholes that exist. But that's just sort of the context in which we approach this issue and why it continues to be of importance for the Leadership Conference.
Thank you for that. Thanks for that, Sakira. Before I move on, I want you to address part of the reason the timing we're convening took place here is that the state of Maryland was the first state to announce that they would be implementing the guidance. And there is a bit of tension around moving to implement when the correct reform from our perspective has actually been put in place. So if you could address a bit of that tension as well, in terms of both what Maryland has done and how your advocacy work has been impacted by states that are starting to do that.
So as Maya noted, Maryland recently announced that they would be, their Attorney General will be issuing guidance on the use of race in accordance and in line with the Department of Justice's guidance, which is a good thing, right? But again, that guidance that the Department of Justice issued only changed two things. It only extended the current ban on the use of race by federal law enforcement agents to other communities. So initially it was race and ethnicity, now it's extended to national origin, religion, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. And it also says, you know, we believe profiling is bad. So to that extent, if Maryland or some other state decides to use that as a model for their guidance, and it will, I guess, to some extent extend to the state and local law enforcement in their area, that still doesn't necessarily address the issues that the current guidance left out, right? So the loopholes for national security and border integrity. The current guidance does not apply to the Customs and Border Patrol agents or the Transportation Security Administration, right? There are specific ways that they can engage in profiling during airport or any other border checkpoint with someone entering the United States and or exiting. It did not address the FBI's mapping program, right? The FBI has consistently, and it's our Director Comey all but admitted that they have been mapping communities, Arab, Muslim, Chinese, Russian, different communities, and collecting data on those communities for investigatory purposes. It did not provide a strong enough mechanism for accountability. There is no enforcement mechanism, right? So even if Maryland does this, if they're using it as a guidepost, what enforcement mechanism will Maryland implement, if at all, because they don't have anything to look towards, to say, yes, this is a good thing, we should implement this here. And finally, just to make sure I don't forget anything, in our opinion, well, it didn't apply to state and local law enforcement, right? We currently give federal funding to state and local law enforcement in a number of ways, and in our opinion, that's a contract. And you can employ upon state and local law enforcement through those contracts what you would like for them to be doing as they are while they're using your funds to engage in law enforcement activities. So if we use what we have now as a guidepost, we'll have an extension to apply to certain communities and protect certain communities, but we won't have necessarily an enforcement mechanism. It won't necessarily address border security issues and or national security issues, and it won't be clear that state and local law enforcement will be abiding by what we believe is the best practice in engaging in policing activities, not using race or any other thing as a proxy for those activities.
Can I respond to that as well?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to turn on the microphone and ask Jennifer to speak to sort of whatever it is you want to respond to, but also to do the national security flavor.
I just wanted to also just add to what Sakira was just describing in terms of why it is so important to have federal law. Right now there is no safety net of state laws that ban racial or any type of profiling. Most states don't have laws, as a matter of fact. And the 29 states that reference profiling in statutes, only 19 of them require law enforcement to collect data. And so the laws at the state level, and then there's no standardization so that the data can actually be helpful or used in a way that will actually drive a policy agenda. And so the law at the state level is just incredibly weak. And so when you add a federal guidance that includes these large carve-outs and you lay that on top of a very weak patchwork of state laws, I think it makes it really clear why we need a strong federal ban on profiling from the Obama administration applied to federal law enforcement, and also we need Congress to take action as well. I just wanted to add that.
No, thank you for that, and I would add to the conversation the point about, Jennifer will say more about sort of the national security for this, but in terms of the conversation on the border security piece, we define border to be anything within 100 miles of the border. So
Inland.
That's correct. So if you look at a map, and I think the ACLU actually has a great map of this, we're talking about the great majority of our urban centers are within 100 miles of the border, and therefore profiling can take place in those areas because of the fact that that loophole exists. So it's not, when you think of border, it's not just point of entry. It is much, much broader than that. So with that, Jennifer, why don't I turn it over to you in terms of your remarks on the sort of the post 9/11 frame, because it's gone from the driving while black dynamic to so many other pieces of it, although that certainly continues to be part of it too.
And I'll just give, just sort of back to what we were talking about a moment ago, big picture. One of the reasons why this is so problematic is that what we're seeing now in immigration enforcement is race-based immigration apprehension. And so, for example, the ACLU had a client in Birmingham, Alabama, who was afraid to leave their home. They were a U.S. citizen, but because of their race and because of their appearance and because of their English as a second language, they feared that if they left their home, that they would be indefinitely detained because they would be suspected of being here unlawfully. And so that is the type of profiling that we're seeing in the immigration context, which is why it's very problematic to try to address something that President Obama has said is wrong, George Bush said it was unconstitutional, in a way that leaves these large carve-outs. And so, and so with that, I mean, I'm happy to share some examples of some cases that the ACLU has worked on that touches on all of these areas, because I think it really emphasizes, it reinforces the idea that this has to be a holistic approach. And one of the cases that the ACLU litigated was actually seen as very groundbreaking. And I guess just to take a step back, because some people may not know exactly what we're talking about when we talk about profiling, so I will just give a definition. And what we mean by profiling is when law enforcement authorities impose interrogations, searches, detention, surveillances on people who are not, where there's no evidence of any type of wrongdoing or criminal activity, but because of that person's perceived race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion, or some other characteristic like sexual orientation. And this type of policing is based on stereotypes and assumptions that have been shown to be false and completely untrue. And it's terrible, not just because of the harm to the victim of profiling, but also because it betrays our fundamental American values and our belief in equal protection under the law. And just I guess, reinforce what the statistics have shown about this and why it's such a problem and how it's so ineffective as a law enforcement tactic. One of the things that we saw in New York State, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the New York study, between October and November of 2011, 94% of students arrested by the New York Police Department were Black or Latinos, and they were 9 times more likely to be arrested than white students, even though the evidence showed that they had not committed more acts of wrongdoing. And then also there was a 2008 report where we found that, and this shows how broad reaching this is across communities of color, Native Americans were 3 times more likely, and African Americans and Hispanics were 2 times more likely to be searched during traffic stops than white Americans, even though white Americans were more likely to be carrying illegal contraband. And everyone can understand how inconvenient a traffic stop is. It's not just like, oh, no big deal, I'll just have my car searched today. But it's very much inconvenient, and it creates this perception of criminality, to be standing on the side of the road, having done nothing wrong, but just to be targeted for this type of invasive search that you may feel powerless to object to because you fear arrest or escalation of force, to be standing on the side of the road and to be subjected to that just based on something that should be constitutionally protected. And so those are a couple of examples of why it's ineffective, but I'll just talk about another instance of it that the ACLU has really taken note of, and I'm not picking on New York, but this is another New York example. The New York Police Department targeted Muslim New Yorkers for surveillance, and that included dispatching undercover officers into Muslim neighborhoods to monitor where they were going to read books, to notice what coffee shops, if you've gone to Pret or if you've gone to, I don't know, I guess Starbucks, which is your preference, I don't know why that's important. Nightclubs, colleges, student organizations, and then also dispatch informants into places of worship, to infiltrate those places of worship, to determine what people are doing, even when there is no evidence of wrongdoing, but simply based on racial, religious identity. And everyone can understand why this is a problem, and you can see the chilling effect of this. One of the students that we worked with from the New York School of Law was saying how, because she was a Muslim person, being in her classroom, she felt like she had to really monitor what she said, because if anything she said seemed, I guess, questionable, she was afraid that she would be targeted for some sort of I guess, negative repercussion. And that's the exact opposite of what we want students to do in an academic environment. They should be able to express themselves and exchange ideas with their professors. And so there are a number of examples that I could provide, and we've also seen it in the LGBT community with excessive stops and assumptions that people are engaging in prostitution and other illegal activity. But we could talk about, there are so many examples, and I guess the reason that I'm sharing these very specific examples is just to remind us all that these types of practices do have an impact on real people, and they have an impact on a wide range of communities. And so for the administration to say that it is wrong and then still permit it in certain instances is completely unacceptable.
Thank you, Jennifer. To be clear, what Jennifer talks about is the NYPD basically spying program into our communities. And it's interesting when the AP broke the story about what was happening in these communities of interest reports, where they, as Jennifer pointed out, you were talking about cafes, you were talking about travel agencies, they would tell you what the channel was in the cafes that folks were frequenting, as if their news source was somehow relevant in this process. It resulted in something that actually we have in the office, where a group of students posted a sign that said "No political conversations in the meetings." And the sign was posted here with an arrow that had the headline from the New York Times story about the surveillance program. And obviously, we all recall our student days on college campuses. These are formative years. These are politically very engaging years. So for these kids to have made a declarative, do not engage in political conversations here, really gets a sense of how chilling the impact is of these types of policies. And I think that's the point of this, right? We kind of, in 2003, after it came out, we understood that we needed to do better, and the idea was we fixed it in December. This directly impacts people's lives. It's one of the reasons why we're pushing and working with multiple congressional offices to say the administration's announcement is not closure on this. It cannot be closure on this, because it allows, frankly, what's happening to sort of continue to happen. Another one of the ways where we wanted to highlight how this issue impacts people's lives is really quite simple. If your government holds you a suspect and is worried about you, perhaps your fellow Americans should be as well. Now, I understand that's a provocative statement, but the reality is that the community being viewed as suspect has meant that people have engaged in some unfortunate stereotype and discrimination, and even more directly, hate crimes. So Arjun, if you could please sort of add that additional component to how these sort of policies, broader laws translate to everyday people's lives in the way that you want to raise.
Great. So piggybacking off what my colleague Jennifer was talking about, there's a very large human cost to these loopholes. And again, just to be clear, right? 4 big loopholes. TSA, CBP are exempted. CBP, the largest law enforcement organization in the United States. Second, the guidance allows for and permits mapping and intelligence programs like the one we saw in New York, right? The monitoring of cafes, the penetration of Muslim student groups, the penetration of mosques. Third, permits the recruiting of informants, right? Agent provocateurs, solely on the basis of targeting, again, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans. Americans. And finally, it exempts state and local law enforcement. So when you look at that panoply of loopholes, I think it's indisputed that there is a social cost. There is a social cost to the broader American public seeing uniformed law enforcement, whether it's local law enforcement, whether it's TSA, whether it's CBP, treating people who are of the Muslim faith, of the Sikh faith, who are African American or Hispanic American differently solely on account of who they are and what they believe. So, for example, we have seen an uptick in hate crimes this year, right? It's hard to say that one directly correlates with the other, but I think, again, there is an impact. So earlier this year in Chapel Hill, as many of you might know, 3 young Muslim Americans lost their lives: Dia Barakat, Yusur Abu Salah, and Razan Abu Salah, in a shooting that took place again earlier this year. The federal government hasn't investigated it as a hate crime because they say that ultimately there were mixed motives involved. But if you look at a lot of the evidence, there's no question that hate and discrimination and bigotry played a very large role, if not an exclusive role in what ultimately happened to them. Just last month, a Sikh American named Indrajit Singh Booker, who's based out of Chicago, was assaulted in a hate crime. He's a cab driver. He was on his way to the grocery store. Someone told him, "Go home, you terrorist." He responded, pulled over. He was attacked and was in the hospital for days. So again, we've seen an uptick in hate crimes. I think it's also fair to say, and to look at the connection even to the anti-Muslim protests that we've seen proliferating across the country just in the last few weeks, right? I mean, I guess just a few weeks ago, protests were announced in more than a dozen cities to denounce Islam. And when you think about protests like that, I think you have to see them in the same vein as law enforcement thinking it appropriate to profile and single out Muslim Americans wherever they go. And relatedly, this might seem like a stretch, but I don't think it is. I even think of Ahmed Muhammad, and I think about what happened to him at his school, right? I mean, here's an enterprising boy with a clock. And if you look at the decision to ultimately arrest and suspend him, right, it wasn't just one individual. It was a teacher, the teacher who first saw the clock, then a group of teachers who decided to call the police, then the police, and then the superintendent who decided to defend it. And while a lot of America rallied in his support, I would actually venture to say that there are plenty of law enforcement officials who, under this guidance, would have probably treated Ahmed exactly the way that any of those other actors did. And for me, that's, again, a great concrete example of the cost that these policies have. Impact on the affected communities, again, it's hard to say. There's no question, as Jennifer pointed out, I think it chills First Amendment protected activity. So if you know that you can be profiled on account of your faith, on account of your appearance, you might be less likely to go to a mosque. You might be less likely to join a Muslim student association. You might be less likely to critique U.S. foreign policy towards an ally in the classroom or at a university. There's also a deeper cost, right? I mean, I think about this sometimes in the context of the Sikh context, right? So Sikh Americans, every time I go to an airport, I'm pulled aside for secondary screening because a turban is considered bulky clothing. Now they don't even need that policy. They don't even need the bulky clothing excuse because they can just do it under the guidance. And I don't have kids, but I wonder what Sikh children think when they see their fathers being pulled aside every time they travel. Or what a young Muslim boy thinks or a young Muslim girl thinks when she's pulled aside, or when they see their mother being pulled aside because they wear a hijab. And finally, and this is a more subtle point, but I think it's an interesting one, policies like this also embolden bad behavior in ways you might not expect. So for example, a group of sociologists looked at stop and frisk. And what they basically found out is that the myopic focus on African Americans and Latino Americans actually emboldened others other communities who were not being profiled, who were not being targeted, to actually engage in additional bad behavior because they realized that they were more likely to get away with it than others. So those are just some of the examples of the social costs of these policies.
Thank you very much, Arjun. Before I open it up to questions and answers, if I can ask each of you to address the fact that this administration feels they've checked this box with the announcement of December 2014, that they're done. So how are we able to push back and keep suggesting, and how are we engaging members of Congress to understand that further revisions are required?
Yeah, sure. So, right after the 2014 guidance was issued, the Leadership Conference, along with our coalition partners, issued a letter. The letter's outside on the table. It's about 5 pages of 7 pages, sorry. 7 including the multiple signers, which I think is about 80 organizations, but 5 pages of content that specifically detail the outstanding concerns around both the loopholes that were left and sort of enshrined in law actually now, to some extent, right? You issued new guidance that is now the standard, and you failed to include 2 important pieces of a ban on profiling. So you sort of unconsciously say that's okay, right? So in addition to outlining the loopholes that Arjun just articulated, also talks about our concerns around implementation, right? There are a number of questions around implementation. Maya mentioned the vicinity rule, right, with CBP being able to work 100 miles inland from our borders around the country. So not just the southern border, but also northern borders. And this in effect brings federal law enforcement into communities to do state and local law enforcement activities, and also partner with them in very problematic ways to engage in these practices. So I would call to your attention that first, that we have not had therefore a response to, unfortunately. The second thing that we've been doing, working with our partners, is so the guidance applied, DOJ issued its part, but it also required DHS to update its guidance based on DHS's new guidance, and specifically the Customs and Border Patrol Agency and the Transportation Security Administration Agency must also update its guidance. So we've been meeting with them regularly about their process and updating the new guidance, and hopefully we'll be seeing something very soon about how they will apply this guidance, but also, in our opinion, extend it or expand it to cover their activities and specifically address how profiling happens at the border, at the airport, and in 100 miles inland of the border as well. So once that new guidance comes out, it's our hope that it will be stronger and close the loopholes that DOJ left open. But again, it's not clear that it will happen. So in addition to that, we've been working on the Racial Profiling Act, and that will be a ban that would apply across the country for both federal and state and local law enforcement, and collect data and require training and address some of the things that this guidance has left untouched. So aside from those 2 things, which we continue to do.
Yeah, and I guess what I'll just add to what Zakira said, political leaders will change their mind in response to the demand of their constituencies. They're accountable to voters. And we have seen so many issues where everything was headed in one direction and it was completely wrong, and it almost seemed like incredible that there was a complete turn of events and a realization that things have needed to go in a different direction. And so what I would say is that, sometimes this struggle for justice is a very long struggle, and it feels like it takes a very long time to see some positive change or results. but we have to just keep pushing until we see the result that we want. And political leaders are responsive to communities, but we have to be unified, and we also have to broaden the number of people who understand how important this is, and how everyone who lives in this country who cares about fairness and justice should be concerned and should be, telling the president that this should be a priority, and also telling Congress that this should be a priority as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There's the grass tops, the lobbying work that we do in Washington with members of the Hill. There's more grassroots work where when lawmakers hear from people in their district, it ends up being very powerful. So if somebody from Minneapolis says, this is what happened to me, and my understanding is that this is allowed under law, and I want you to change that, and they keep hearing, and then maybe they start hearing from an entire community, it matters. And then finally, maybe being, also a little more creative too, engaging the civil sector. Academics, mental health professionals. The SIG Coalition is partnering with a group of social scientists who are actually basically they're coming out with studies imminently that show the terrible negative health outcomes associated with profiling, associated with bigotry. They include things like depression, anxiety, life expectancy, reduced life expectancy, reduced socioeconomic mobility. So, bringing the whole weight of sort of academia and the civilian sector to bear on this issue as well.
And if I can just add something to what Jennifer said about engagement of communities, I forgot to mention this. The Leadership Conference just did a poll, an online poll of about 880 Americans across demographics. And what we found, we polled on 3 issues: racial profiling, body cameras, and civil asset forfeiture. And you can make it, you can see why we put those 3 issues together, right? Because profiling happens in the context of body cameras and civil asset forfeiture. But an overwhelming majority of Americans said they support a ban on racial profiling. It was like 66% of Americans that said they support a ban on profiling. Of course, that number jumped up when we looked at African Americans and Latinos. It was like 72% and 78% respectively. But there's a recognition in this country that we should not judge people based on who they are, right, and what they look like. But we should judge them by their actions, their deeds, right? The content of their character, as one great person said once before. So, I think if that's the case, and our members of Congress are here to do the people's work, then it only makes sense that they would take up this issue in a bipartisan fashion and pass the Racial Profiling Act. It only makes sense that the Customs and Border Patrol Agency, the Transportation Security Administration Agency, and the Department of Justice would address these loopholes and make it clear that implementation is important and that state and local law enforcement must not engage in these activities. So I think it's important on us that any time that we're having conversations with our family members that we raise this issue, that they are aware of it. I think people know what it is, but they don't really know that there's something that they can do about it. So.
I would also add, we didn't touch upon this at all today just because of limited time, but when you engage in law enforcement work without a criminal predicate, it is incredibly inefficient to profile people. It simply doesn't work. If anything, the NYPD case, surveillance case showed not a single conviction of anything. So imagine all those tax dollars, all that time spent profiling people and doing the work that they did, and not a single criminal conviction brought forward from all of that effort. So we didn't get into any of that, but there's also that element of it that I think is lawmakers should care about in terms of providing oversight. These are policies that regrettably do not work, in addition to being counterproductive for the very reasons that we've highlighted today. Why don't we go ahead and take some questions from members of the audience, please?
Karen from Congressman Cummings' office. Just to understand a bit more historically, has there ever been federal guidance that applied to state and local law enforcement on this issue? Like the 2003 guidance didn't cover it or anything?
No, you're going to
Oh, okay. So in 2003, Attorney General Ashcroft issued guidance, and it banned, because President Bush recognized it was wrong, and so did Attorney General Ashcroft. And so they issued guidance that banned profiling, but it left these loopholes for national security and border integrity. It did not apply to states. One of the things that came in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin and the Trayvon Martin killing and all of the other deaths that we saw around the country was a very focused advocacy effort geared towards Attorney General Holder. And as a result of that, one of the changes to the guidance was applying it to state and local law enforcement when they are working in concert with federal law enforcement agencies. So that was sort of a very limited fix as a result of some of the things that were happening around the country and the advocacy that happened. But we obviously need comprehensive application to states.
And then just to follow up, in your sense, based on your conversations with the DOJ, do you know where that reluctance is coming from? I mean, is it just that is it them saying that, you know, there are just too many different systems out there, we can't really come up with one guidance, or are they just fear of the backlash? Because thinking time-wise too, this was a few months after, or a month after the immigration actions, and, you know, there's a lot of backlash on that too.
I mean, I would, when they announced the guidance in 2014, the FBI said thank you, but no thank you. That was sort of the initial response back saying, this is great, but they don't really apply to us, right? And then there are folks within DOJ. It's so large that there really is a lot of, I think, difficulty in terms of navigating even internally within the department, so much as members of Congress stepping into it. So I think there are absolutely allies who understand that this work isn't done within the Department of Justice. And when Secura talks about the efforts that are underway with DHS officials to address the TSA CBP piece, it's there. But I just don't see any leadership high enough that has said this needs to be looked at. So that's, in my opinion, that's sort of the politics of this is really problematic for that reason. And I think, as Jennifer pointed out, until there are constituents who elevate it, right, until it becomes part of something bigger, and until members of Congress step up and provide the oversight to say our work isn't done here, they're going to be able to kind of proceed with this in place the way that it has been, in my opinion.
I mean, I would add that, to your point to Jennifer's point about the working with federal law enforcement in the context of working with state, that even in that context, even though that exists, that ban, it applies in that context, there are still outstanding questions, right, with regards to what that means, right? How do we define these task forces? What are the prevalency of the task forces? What are the accountability mechanisms to ensure that even in those contexts, profiling is not taking place when they're working together? So those outstanding questions, even though it applies in that context, we still don't know if they're actually enforcing it. Or enforcing the application as they're working with state and local law enforcement. And so the other point about DOJ's resilience, I guess, to impose, in my opinion, the authority that they have on state and local law enforcement. I mean, one thing we've consistently talked to them about is that you have the right under Title VI to condition federal funds on compliance with Title VI. And in our opinion, you can spell out what compliance with Title VI means. You can say compliance means a ban on profiling. Compliance means collect data on stops and arrests and frisks, etc. So we've been pushing them in that way to say, hey, you can condition on federal funds that you're giving out to state and local law enforcement on their ability to show that they have a band at the local level, that they are collecting data, and they are doing training in places where they find that there are some issues as the data is collected and analyzed.
I'm just surprised, even if they don't want to go that far as to make it enforceable and have it be tied to funds, why not put out guidance that's useful for state and local law enforcement they can follow instead of having them do what it sounds like they're doing now, which is taking bits and pieces from what is very federal guidance and trying to apply it to states.
Yeah, it's not clear why they haven't been creative.
Well, I think, one of the tensions that we're seeing, there is some division, right? And so I think what we are saying is that there has to be a shift in thinking. I mean, we have to, I guess, have some sort of And some people have already had it, but I think we have to shift our thinking in this country so that we are targeting people based on evidence of criminality and evidence of wrongdoing, as opposed to targeting people based on who they are. And we have a history of targeting people based on who they are. So it's not a radical idea that we're continuing to do that, but I think we really have to take that next step and stop doing it in a law enforcement context as well, because we've gotten better, in other contexts, but I think this is a holdout area. And so that is part of the process that we need to see, finished. So we'll have true social justice and civil rights.
My name is Congressman Judy Chu. I want to let you all know that I met with Secretary Johnson yesterday, and he specifically asked about the DHS upcoming guidance, and he had no idea. And his staff wasn't prepared to talk about it either, which was surprising because I think that they knew that it was something that we were going to ask about because we've gone back and forth. And so there was just no commitment on like what's coming out or whether they're working on that. Also, we're still not clear on whether it's CBP specific or because we also heard that there might be a department-wide guidance, and there's just no clarity on the issue. But I wanted to go also a little bit into the point about implementation. Sakir sort of mentioned this a few times, right? But so of course it's of vital importance to have, in writing, a policy that doesn't have the kind of loopholes that we have now. But I think really what it comes down to is, increased sort of culturally sensitive, training, and race-specific, gender, religion, all of those issues. Because I feel like and I want to ask Jennifer about sort of from a legal point of view, I feel like the reasonable suspicion standard is so low that a lot of these sort of law enforcement agencies are able to get away with, profiling, saying, oh, well, there was enough evidence, or it was reasonable suspicion. And so, even if you close these loopholes, I feel like even the way the law stands, and of course, this is the reasonable suspicion standard is, I don't know that we can, revise it or change it, but I think its implementation is also problematic with the, with the espionage cases. A lot of Chinese Americans are several examples of people who, on reasonable suspicion, on that standard, were, had all sorts of allegations filed against them, and then they were all eventually dropped, and then nobody had to apologize or say, we made a mistake, what was wrong with us, because there was reasonable suspicion. So could you speak to?
Yeah, I think you're talking about something that's a really important point. And I think one of the challenges that we see when we're dealing with policies that are very sort of racially driven and bias driven is that it's not the, it's not the sort of stereotypical racist type situation or racist type person that everyone would identify as a bad person and no one would agree with. But it's the little biases that accumulate over time to the harm of certain communities. And I think everyone has certain biases that we have to account for in our decision making. But I think when we're acknowledging that we have the bias, we can correct for it. But I think part of what we see is, this thing called this implicit bias. So if you see one person driving in a car with tinted windows, you make a certain assumption about that person. Maybe they're, doing something that they shouldn't be doing, or they're a certain type of person. Another person, is just for convenience or is for some legitimate purpose. So I think it's the accumulation of bias that makes it so important for us to address this issue in a uniform way. And also the training material can't be biased. I mean, it has to be adequate as well in order to get to what you're saying.
I was just,
No, I was just going to say on the point of training material, there's not a lot of confidence in any of that process. When investigative journalists uncovered some of the material that specifically the FBI was using, the most egregious examples of stereotypes and discrimination that you could imagine with regards to Arabs, Muslims, African Americans, the wide range. So when we talk about training material and improving that process, there's also not a lot of confidence that this is the way it ought to be.
and just to your point about reasonable suspicion, I was on a panel talking about body cameras. a couple weeks ago, a month or so ago. And there was a police chief from New Jersey, or former police chief from New Jersey, who was talking about profiling and how the department thought they didn't have a problem with profiling. There's no profiling, whatever. But they had been hearing from the NAACP and the ACLU that yes, this is happening to our members, to our community members. We know this is taking place, but they had nothing to back it up with, right? Just the anecdotes. So it wasn't until that chief said, okay, well, we're going to start collecting data. I'm going to start requiring my patrol officers to collect data on stops and with any other investigative search. And once they started collecting the data, even that reasonable suspicion skewed in favor of the fact that they were only using it against certain communities, only using it against blacks and Latinos and even people that they perceived to be Arab or Muslim or some other ethnicity. And so in the face of what I would agree with you is a sort of a broad description that can be applied in some broad context. If you have data collection, it helps you to prove the case that that reasonable suspicion is biased, right, and is only being applied in certain ways. And that's why, from our perspective, we think that they can now collect data. They can require state and local law enforcement to collect and report that data to the federal government, and that's outlined in our letter to the president and to the attorney general. And also, it's also in the Enrich Your Profiling Act. There is data collection in that piece, and that data helps to better train, right? Helps to do the things that Maya and Jennifer were just talking about. But you have to have the data to support what we already know.
And what I would just add to that is that with the data, you have to have the hit rates.
Yes.
I mean, you can't just say this is the number of people who were stopped. You have to say how many people were stopped, how many people were actually engaged in criminal activity. Because that really shows you the real story, right? Because, there can always be the continued assumption that people are just being stopped based on criminality or evidence of wrongdoing. But when the data shows that that's not what's happening, you can make some policy changes to adjust for that.
Mm-hmm. So we've got room for one more question. Okay, two more, that's it. So we'll do to you and we'll wrap up. And I'm sorry for going over.
Sorry, my question is regarding the Maryland implementation. What does that look like? What changes could we see on a state-based level, and what actually will be happening based on that?
I haven't. The announcement just happened, I think, maybe a week or so ago. A month or so ago. Okay.
And I don't think it's clear yet.
So it's not clear, right? I haven't seen the actual guidance that they put out, or if they have put out actual guidance yet to look at it, to be able to compare and say this. But if they are following, we can make sort of a general conclusion that if they're following the DOJ's guidance, there will still be loopholes for national security and border integrity. And parts of Maryland will fall within that 100-mile radius, right? And so that's a huge concern for us.
And therein lies the problem, right? Which is it's a state that's saying proactively, we want to take a position against profiling, therefore we're going to adopt these guidelines, with the idea being that this is the vehicle to do that. And that really is sort of the main concern here, is that we have to fix the largest domino before it ripples down into sort of other places.
Yeah.
So let's go with Sheldon, last question.
Yeah, do you guys believe that this profiling is basically like a learned behavior from someone's upbringing, or do you believe it's kind of something that's implemented through society? And if so, we mentioned the training programs kind of being not so great. What is the best way to not only just limit profiling in law enforcement, but in society in general, to kind of get rid of that mindset?
That is a question. I will defer to my colleagues on answering a portion of it. I will just take you back to in the Clinton administration, before 9/11 ever took place. There was a system called CAPS that automated passenger profiling. The idea being, this is the old adage that you hear from brilliants like Bill Maher, right? Like, don't stop grandma. It's obviously you shouldn't stop grandma. You should stop X, Y, and Z. And CAPS at the time in the 90s put in place a system where you would presume there are groups that present a heightened security concern, and therefore you should look at them. So while I think there are many interesting sociological or psychological ways to sort of look at how we respond as humans to one thing or another. Our issue really is about the law enforcement doing its job effectively. And while I may have a personal bias, I certainly don't want the police officer that's protecting me to have that same bias. And I think it's about sort of holding law enforcement to a more appropriate standard. So I don't recall, I mean, the 90s system, there was a great deal of pushback on it. And then really we're in a whole new world in a post 9/11 environment. And I think that's played out sort of differently. But I would ask any of my colleagues to offer any
I think I would
response or
say,
closing remarks.
I think I would say, because, you know, I think a lot, people are generally, no one's perfect, people are generally gonna be born with, you know, certain biases, just because of, you know, the society that we live in, and I guess just being a human being. But I think when if you've given someone law enforcement authority and you've given them the ability to arrest someone, take away their freedom, you know, all of these chains of negative consequences that can happen from that interaction, I think you have to have three things: it's standards, safeguards, and accountability. And so the rules have to be clear. You know, we have to say in a very unequivocal way that this is terrible, it's wrong, it's illegal, it's, you know, it's everything that the president said it was. But in addition to making that statement of prohibition, we have to put safeguards in place to make sure it is not happening. And that's where the data collection on hit rates and, you know, and that type of thing actually comes into play. And then the other part is holding people accountable when they deviate from the standard that we have set, and providing them training so that they can actually, you know, engage in lawful policing.
Everyone has bias. The job of the government is not to succumb to bias.
And just to your larger point about how do we root this out in, not just in the context of this issue, but just in society. I mean, I think it's recognizing that, like he said, and like everyone has said, unconscious bias exists. And I don't want to make a general statement that people are inherently biased, right? But I think that it's learned behavior. And I think until we recognize that our country, and to some extent its history is storied and has a history of bias, a history of sort of racism, right? And that has been institutionalized and normalized. And so when people are categorized as other, and we see this in the media, and it's perpetuated in the media and on television, and our journalists don't have or engage in the type of, in my opinion, talk that perpetuates it in the public, and public picks up on it and starts saying just because someone has a hijab, they're, you know, representing something that is bad. That's problematic, and that's how it continues to permeate throughout society. And until we start to confront those things and say, no, this isn't right, and each of us takes it upon ourselves in our personal lives to confront people who say things that aren't right and we know to be wrong, confront media that perpetuates these types of stereotypes, we won't be able to really deal with the issues that you're talking about on a global scale, not just as it relates to law enforcement, but as it relates to our communities and our societies as a whole.
Thanks again for taking the time to be with us and for the thoughtful questions on Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The Arab American Institute, the ACLU, and the C Coalition, all here as resources for you to continue working on these issues. Thanks so much.